I'm Samantha Wells, 26, and 6 months ago I was slinging coffee and burgers at the Crossroads Diner off Highway 15 Inches, Montana. My uniform reeked of grease, my feet ached, and my truck, which doubled as my bedroom, needed repairs I couldn't afford. 3 years earlier, I'd been set to inherit $850,000 from my father's estate. Then my stepmother Judith told me it had all vanished in failed cryptocurrency investments. I believed her until that Tuesday night when I was wiping down the counter and looked up to see my Uncle Howard standing there. The same uncle I'd been told died 3 years ago. Before I dive into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If this sounds like the beginning of a nightmare you can't look away from, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Trust me, what happened after my dead uncle walked into that diner changed everything, and might just save you from the same trap my family fell into. To understand how I ended up homeless and working at a roadside diner, you need to know about my family. My father, Richard Wells, built a successful tech security company from scratch. We weren't billionaires, but we lived comfortably in a beautiful home in a Seattle suburb. My childhood was happy until I turned 12, when my mother was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. She fought hard for 8 months before passing away. Dad and I were devastated. For almost 2 years, it was just the two of us trying to navigate our grief. I'd come home from school to find him staring at Mom's photos, and some nights I'd hear him crying through the walls. He threw himself into work, and I grew up fast, learning to take care of myself and sometimes him too. Everything changed when Dad attended a technology conference in San Francisco. That's where he met Judith Taylor. She was elegant, poised, and worked in investment banking. I still remember the first time he brought her home for dinner. I was 14 and immediately suspicious. But she came bearing thoughtful gifts, a journal because Dad mentioned I liked to write, and concert tickets for a band I loved. "I know I could never replace your mother," she told me that night while Dad was in the kitchen. "But I hope we can be friends, Samantha. Your father talks about you constantly." Over the next several months, Judith methodically won us both over. She asked about my interests, attended my school events, and seemed genuinely interested in my life. When Dad wasn't around, she would confide in me about her own difficult childhood, creating a false sense of intimacy between us. Looking back, I can see it was all calculated, but at the time, I was just a teenager desperate for maternal guidance. When Dad proposed to Judith after dating for a year, I gave my blessing. By then, I'd met her daughter Heather, who was 2 years younger than me. Heather was quiet and seemed perpetually bored, but I made efforts to connect with her, offering to share my room until Dad could convert the home office for her. They married when I was 16. That's when subtle changes began. Judith started redecorating, removing photos of my mother. When I protested, she apologized profusely, claiming she just wanted the house to feel like our family home rather than a shrine to the past. Dad took her side, saying it was time to move forward. It was our first real argument since Mom died. Throughout these changes, my Uncle Howard remained my rock. My father's only brother, Howard was a tech genius who'd helped Dad start his business before branching out on his own. Unlike Dad, who wore suits and maintained a corporate image, Howard wore faded jeans and band t-shirts despite his success. He lived about an hour away and would take me hiking or to museums when Dad was busy. Howard never said anything explicitly negative about Judith, but I could tell he was wary. "Just remember who you are, Sam," he told me during one of our outings. "Don't let anyone change that." When I mentioned this comment to Judith, her smile tightened for just a second before she laughed it off. "Brothers can be so protective," she said. "Howard's probably just worried about sharing Richard's attention." I graduated high school and went to college, majoring in business like Dad wanted. During my senior year, he called me, sounding exhausted but happy. His company had received a buyout offer he couldn't refuse. He was selling the business and looking forward to early retirement. "I want to travel with Judith," he said, "and there will be plenty for you and Heather when the time comes." 3 months later, he was dead. A massive heart attack at 52. One minute he was playing golf, and the next, paramedics were trying unsuccessfully to revive him. The funeral was a blur. Judith was the perfect grieving widow, holding my hand through the service while simultaneously managing everything with eerie efficiency. Howard flew in from a business trip in Japan, looking shattered. He and Dad had spoken just days earlier. "I'll take care of her," I overheard Judith telling Howard at the reception. "Richard would want us to stay together as a family." Howard nodded, but his eyes were guarded. A week after the funeral, we met with Dad's attorney for the reading of the will. I expected the estate to be divided between Judith and me, with perhaps something set aside for Heather. Instead, I learned that Dad had revised his will just a year earlier. The house and most liquid assets went to Judith. I was to receive $850,000 from Dad's life insurance and investments, but with a condition: Judith would manage the funds until I turned 25, ostensibly to make sure I didn't squander my inheritance. At 23, I had to wait 2 more years for full control. When I expressed surprise at this arrangement, Judith squeezed my hand. "Your father was protecting you," she said softly. "He wanted to make sure you had time to mature financially. I promised to manage it wisely until then." The attorney, Mr. Peterson, seemed slightly uncomfortable but confirmed this was indeed Richard's wish. Howard frowned throughout the reading but said nothing until we were alone outside. "This doesn't sound like Richard," he told me quietly. "I'm going to look into some things. In the meantime, be careful, Sam." 3 days later, Howard left for what Judith described as an extended business trip overseas. I spoke to him briefly before he left, and he promised to stay in touch. I had no idea that within weeks, Judith would inform me that my uncle had died in a boating accident off the coast of Thailand, a claim I had no reason to doubt at the time. A year passed after Dad's death, and life settled into an uncomfortable routine. I was 24, living in my childhood home with Judith and Heather, working an entry-level marketing job, and trying to ignore the growing tension in the house. Judith had changed. The warm, supportive woman who had won my trust was replaced by someone who scrutinized my every move. She questioned my work hours, criticized my friends, and frequently reminded me that I was living in her home. Gone were our heart-to-heart talks. Now our interactions consisted mainly of her delegating household chores or asking when I planned to move out. Heather, now in college, had transformed too. The quiet, withdrawn girl had become entitled and openly hostile toward me. She helped herself to my clothes and belongings without asking, claimed the best parking spot in the driveway as hers, and made comments about how I was basically a tenant in what should have been my family home too. As my 25th birthday approached, I began asking Judith about my inheritance. Each time, she deflected with vague assurances that everything was being handled and she was getting paperwork in order. When I pressed for details, she would sigh dramatically and say, "Do you really think I don't have enough to deal with already, Samantha?" One evening, I received a strange call from an international number. The man spoke broken English and identified himself as a resort manager in Phuket, Thailand. He regretfully informed me that my uncle, Howard Wells, had died in a boating accident. Shocked and confused, I immediately called for Judith. Her reaction seemed rehearsed. She took the phone, exchanged a few words with the caller, then turned to me with practiced sympathy. "Oh, Samantha, I'm so sorry. Poor Howard." What struck me as odd was how quickly Judith handled everything. She told me cremation was standard procedure in Thailand for foreign nationals, and within days claimed to have received Howard's ashes. There was no funeral, No memorial service, just a small box she placed on the mantel that disappeared within a week. When I asked about it, she said she'd found a more appropriate resting place for him. My suspicions grew when I overheard Judith on the phone late one night, speaking in hushed tones. "It's handled," she said to someone. She doesn't suspect anything. When she saw me in the doorway, she quickly ended the call and claimed she'd been speaking to her sister about a surprise party for Heather. A few weeks later, while Judith and Heather were at a spa weekend, I decided to look through Judith's home office. I told myself I was just looking for information about my inheritance, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. In the bottom drawer of her desk, hidden under tax files, I found a folder with my name on it. Inside were bank statements showing multiple withdrawals from what appeared to be my trust fund, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, dating back to shortly after my father's death. I took photos of the documents with trembling hands, then carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it. When Judith returned, I confronted her directly. "I want to know about my inheritance," I said over dinner. "I turn 25 next month, and I need to understand exactly what's happening with my money." Judith set down her fork and exchanged a look with Heather. "I was going to discuss this with you next week, but I suppose now is as good a time as any." Her voice took on a rehearsed quality. "Samantha, I've been trying to find the right way to tell you this. There's been a significant problem with your inheritance." According to Judith, she had invested my entire inheritance in cryptocurrency on the advice of experts she knew from her banking days. She claimed the investments had completely collapsed, leaving almost nothing of my $850,000. "I was trying to grow it for you," she said, her eyes welling with tears that never quite fell. "The advisors promised returns of 300% or more. I trusted them with my own money too. When I demanded to see documentation, she produced elaborate statements showing investments in obscure cryptocurrencies I'd never heard of. The documents looked professional, but something felt off about them. "This is impossible," I said, my voice rising. "You lost all of it? Every cent? Don't you dare accuse my mother of anything," Heather shouted, leaping to Judith's defense. "She was trying to help you. She's been managing your ungrateful behind for years. And this is how you repay her?" Judith put on a performance of being wounded by my suspicion. "Your father trusted me with this responsibility. Do you think I wanted to give you this news? I've been sick about it for months." I demanded to speak to the investment advisors myself, but Judith claimed they had disappeared after the collapse. When I suggested involving the police, she became indignant. "And tell them what? That legitimate investments failed? That's not a crime, Samantha, that's just bad luck." That night, I heard them talking in the kitchen when they thought I was upstairs. "She bought it, right?" Heather asked. "Of course she did," Judith replied. "Samantha's always been gullible, just like her father." Their laughter felt like ice water in my veins. The next day, Judith's friend Greg came over. I'd met him a few times at dinner parties. Judith hosted a slick, silver-haired man who claimed to be a financial advisor. Judith presented him as a neutral third party who could explain the investment failure to me. Greg sat me down with charts and technical jargon, explaining how volatile cryptocurrency markets could be and how even the experts sometimes got it wrong. When I asked pointed questions about the specific currencies and exchanges used, he became evasive, eventually suggesting that my emotional state was preventing me from understanding complex financial matters. As he was leaving, I saw him squeeze Judith's hand in a way that suggested they were more than friends. Everything about the situation felt wrong, but I had no proof beyond my instincts and some photocopied bank statements that didn't explicitly prove fraud. I knew then that I was on my own, and that recovering my inheritance would require more than just accusations. I needed evidence, and I needed help. The day after confronting Judith, I consulted a lawyer I found through a Google search. Mr. Daniels listened patiently to my story in his small office above a dry cleaner's, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Miss Wells, I don't want to discourage you," he said when I finished, "but this is going to be difficult to prove. Without clear evidence of fraud, it becomes your word against your stepmother's. And unfortunately, the will gives her legal authority over the funds until you turn 25. But I have the bank statements showing withdrawals," I insisted. "Which she could claim were legitimate investment transfers," he countered. "We need documentation showing where that money actually went. Proof that these cryptocurrencies never existed or that she transferred the funds to personal accounts." I left with a list of documents to try to obtain and a $300 bill I could barely afford. When I returned home, I immediately noticed something was wrong. My laptop wasn't where I'd left it. When I found it, the password had been changed. After several attempts, I managed to get in, only to discover that files had been accessed and my browser history cleared. That night, I set up my phone to record while I slept, hiding it between books on my shelf. In the morning, I played back the recording and heard my bedroom door opening around 2 a.m., followed by the sound of drawers being carefully opened and closed. Things began disappearing from my room: jewelry my mother had left me, important documents, and personal mementos. When I confronted Judith, she looked at me with rehearsed concern. "Samantha, I'm worried about you. First accusations about the inheritance. Now you're claiming things are missing. Your mother had episodes of paranoia before her diagnosis. Perhaps we should have you evaluated." "My mother was never paranoid," I snapped, but the seed had been planted. Was she suggesting my mother had mental health issues? That wasn't true, but how would I prove it to anyone else? A week later, I discovered several financial documents with my signature on them, documents I had never seen before, authorizing large transfers from my trust. The signatures looked like mine, but with subtle differences. When I showed the documents to Mr. Daniels, he agreed they were suspicious, but said proving forgery would require expensive forensic analysis. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Judith began telling family friends that she was concerned about my mental state. I overheard her on the phone describing me as increasingly paranoid and displaying troubling behaviors. She suggested I might be using drugs or suffering from the same issues that had supposedly afflicted my mother. The gaslighting intensified. I would place my car keys in my purse, only to find them missing when I needed to leave for work. My alarm would fail to go off, making me late. My work presentations would disappear from my email outbox. Each time, Judith would shake her head with theatrical concern when I expressed frustration. "Maybe you should see someone, dear," she'd suggest. "Memory problems can be a sign of stress." Heather played her part perfectly. When others were around, she'd make comments like, "Has anyone seen Sam's medications? I don't think she's been taking them, though I wasn't on any prescription drugs." Or she'd ask loudly if I was feeling more stable today, creating a false history of instability. The breaking point came during a dinner Judith hosted for her side of the family. I rarely attended these gatherings, but she had insisted, saying her relatives were worried about me. Throughout the evening, her brothers, sisters, and their spouses treated me with the careful deference one might show to someone extremely fragile. They exchanged knowing glances when I spoke and redirected conversations away from anything remotely controversial. Then Heather arrived late, making a grand entrance. On her finger was my mother's engagement ring, a family heirloom my father had specifically noted in his will was to go to me on my 25th birthday. "Where did you get that?" I demanded, interrupting her announcement about her new internship. Heather blinked innocently. "Mom gave it to me. It was just sitting in her jewelry box collecting dust." "That's my mother's ring. Dad left it to me." I turned to Judith. "You had no right to give it away." "Samantha," Judith said with practiced patience, "we've discussed this. That ring was given to me by your father. I believe you're confused again. I'm not confused. It's in the will. My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I think you should go lie down, Judith said firmly, nodding to her brother-in-law Dan, who stood as if prepared to escort me out. I looked around the table at the pitying faces and realized this entire dinner had been staged, an opportunity for Judith to demonstrate my supposed instability to witnesses. I stood up, shaking with fury. "You're stealing from me," I said clearly. "All of you sitting here are witnessing fraud." As I turned to leave, Heather burst into tears, capturing everyone's sympathy. I heard Judith comforting her as I walked out. "It's not her fault, sweetie. She can't help these outbursts." That night, I tried to record a conversation between Judith and Heather through my bedroom wall. They were discussing what to do about me, with Judith suggesting they might need to take more serious measures. But when I checked my phone in the morning, the recording app had been uninstalled and my phone reset to factory settings. 3 days later, I came home from work to find my room completely empty except for my bed and dresser. My clothes were stuffed into garbage bags in the corner. My books, photographs, and personal items were gone. Judith stood in the doorway, no longer bothering with the concerned act. "I've had enough of your accusations and erratic behavior. This is my house, and I want you out." "This is my family home," I protested. "Dad wanted me to live here." "Check the deed," she said coldly. "Richard transferred ownership to me before he died. I have the legal right to evict anyone I choose." She handed me an official-looking document. "You have 48 hours. I called Mr. Daniels in a panic, but his response was discouraging. Without my name on the deed, and with no lease agreement, I had few rights as an occupant in what was legally Judith's home. Fighting the eviction would be costly and likely unsuccessful. That night, I packed what remained of my belongings into my old Ford truck, including the few documents I had managed to hide away as evidence. As I was leaving, Heather watched from the staircase, twisting my mother's ring around her finger. "You should have just played along," she said, almost regretfully. "Mom always gets what she wants in the end." I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting against people who had systematically worked to destroy my connection to my parents, my home, and even my sense of reality. But with nowhere to go and almost no resources, my options were painfully limited. The reality of homelessness hit me hard and fast. I had exactly $843 in my checking account, a truck with 178,000 miles on it, and no place to go. I spent the first night parked at a 24-hour Walmart, too afraid to sleep, watching shoppers come and go under the fluorescent lights until dawn broke. With my limited funds, I checked into the cheapest motel I could find, a dingy place called the West Side Inn that charged $59 per night. I calculated I could stay for about 2 weeks while looking for work and a more permanent solution. The room smelled of cigarettes and the shower ran lukewarm at best, but it had a lock on the door and a bed that wasn't the back seat of my truck. Each morning, I'd dress in my most professional clothes and head out to look for jobs. I applied for everything: office work, retail positions, restaurant jobs, but Judith's influence extended further than I'd imagined. At 3 different interviews, I could tell from the interviewer's expression that they recognized my name. One woman actually said, "Wells. Are you related to Judith Taylor Wells?" When I acknowledged that she was my stepmother, the interviewer's demeanor changed instantly. "I'm sorry, but I don't think you'd be a good fit for our company culture," she said, shuffling my resume into a drawer without looking at it again. Later, I learned through a sympathetic receptionist that Judith had been warning her business contacts about me, describing me as unstable, untrustworthy, and potentially violent. In our tight-knit business community, her words carried weight. By day 10 at the motel, my funds were dwindling fast, and I still had no job prospects. I expanded my search area, driving 40 miles out of the city to apply for positions where Judith might have less influence. That's how I found the Crossroads Diner, a truck stop restaurant on Highway 15, well outside Seattle. The owner, Ruby Parker, was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked me up and down when I walked in, asking about the waitress wanted sign in the window. "Ever waited tables before?" she asked. "No, but I'm a fast learner," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. 12-hour shifts, minimum wage plus tips. Truckers are decent tippers if you're fast and don't mess up their orders. Weekends and holidays mandatory. Still interested? I started that afternoon. The work was physically demanding, carrying heavy trays, being on my feet for 12 hours straight, dealing with tired truckers and occasional drunks from the adjoining bar. But Ruby was fair, and the other waitress, Abigail, showed me the ropes. When my motel money ran out, I faced the reality I'd been dreading: living in my truck. I found a secluded spot behind the diner where Ruby let me park overnight. I converted my back seat into a makeshift bed using blankets I bought at a thrift store. The first night, I cried myself to sleep, thinking about how just months earlier I'd had a home and a future that included financial security. Daily life became an exercise in problem solving. I showered at a truck stop that offered facilities for $7. I used the diner's bathroom during shifts and brushed my teeth there. I joined a gym with a $10 monthly fee primarily to use their showers on my days off. I kept my clothes in plastic bins in my truck, carefully organizing them so I wouldn't appear homeless to customers or coworkers. Abigail, who worked the same shift, became the closest thing I had to a friend. She was around 40, with a kind face and practical manner. She noticed things: how I always arrived early and left late, how I never mentioned going home, how I washed my uniform in the diner's sink after closing. But she didn't pry. One night, about a month into this arrangement, my truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and after a jump start from a kind trucker, the mechanic at the service station next door informed me that I needed a new alternator, a $400 repair I couldn't afford. "I can do payments," I offered desperately. The mechanic, Dave, looked uncomfortable. "Boss doesn't allow it. Cash or credit only." I had to choose between fixing my truck, my only shelter, or eating for the next 2 weeks. I chose the truck, surviving on diner leftovers Ruby pretended not to notice me taking, and the cheapest ramen noodles from the convenience store. As summer turned to fall, I began to worry about the approaching winter. Montana winters are brutally cold, and sleeping in an unheated truck could be dangerous, even deadly. I started researching homeless shelters in the area, but the nearest one was 30 miles away in the opposite direction from the diner. Without reliable transportation, I couldn't maintain my job and stay at the shelter. In October, I caught a severe cold that turned into bronchitis. I worked through it, sweating and coughing, until Ruby noticed me nearly collapsing during a shift. "Go home, girl," she ordered. "You're scaring the customers." I didn't tell her I had no home to go to. Instead, I spent 3 miserable days in my truck, shivering under blankets, taking over-the-counter cold medicine I could barely afford. On the 3rd night, Ruby found me there, delirious with fever. Without a word, she helped me into her old Buick and drove me to her small house on the outskirts of town. She put me in her spare bedroom and called her sister, a retired nurse, who came over with antibiotics left over from her husband's recent illness. "Don't make a fuss," Ruby said when I tried to thank her the next morning. "Just get better and get back to work. Can't handle the breakfast rush alone." But that brief kindness made me realize how precarious my situation truly was. One serious illness or injury could leave me completely destitute or worse. I had no health insurance, no safety net, no family to call for help. While recovering at Ruby's, I used her computer to check social media. I hadn't logged into my accounts for months, partly because I couldn't bear to see my old life, and partly because I was afraid Judith might be monitoring them. What I found made me physically ill. Heather had posted photos of her newly renovated bedroom, my old room, completely transformed with expensive furniture. There were pictures of her and Judith on vacation in the Maldives, at designer stores in New York, at exclusive restaurants. In one photo, Heather was showing off a brand new BMW with the caption, "Best graduation gift ever. Thanks, Mom." I scrolled through months of evidence that they were living luxuriously off what I strongly suspected was my inheritance. The final blow was a post announcing Heather's fashion consulting business, which she was starting with seed money from Mom. The timing aligned perfectly with when I should have received control of my trust fund. When I returned to work and my truck, I felt completely defeated. I had no proof that would stand up in court, no money for legal help, and no way to fight back against Judith's systematic destruction of my life. For the first time, I considered giving up, accepting that the money was gone and trying to rebuild from nothing. That night, huddled in my truck as temperatures dropped below freezing for the first time that season, I wondered if anything would ever change. Little did I know that change was about to walk through the diner's door. The Crossroads Diner had a predictable rhythm. Truckers came through in waves, locals showed up for the same meals on the same days, and the occasional lost tourist stumbled in looking confused. After 6 months, I knew most of the regulars by name and order. That's why I noticed immediately when Abigail started acting strangely one Tuesday evening. She kept looking at me, then away quickly, wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. Finally, during a lull between the dinner and late-night crowds, she cornered me in the supply closet. "Sam, how long have you been living in your truck?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so careful. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. Abigail's expression was kind but firm. "I've known for months. Ruby knows too. We were waiting for you to say something, but you never did." My eyes filled with tears of humiliation. "Please don't tell anyone else." "I won't," she promised. "But it's getting colder, and that truck isn't safe in winter. My shift ends in an hour. Meet me in the parking lot after?" Later, sitting in Abigail's warm car with a thermos of hot coffee between us, the whole story poured out of me: my father's death, Judith's manipulation, the stolen inheritance, the eviction, everything. It was the first time I'd told anyone the complete truth, and the relief was overwhelming. When I finished, Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," she said finally. 3 simple words, but they broke something open inside me. Someone believed me. I wasn't crazy. "There's something I should tell you," Abigail continued. "Before I moved here, I worked for Goldman Sachs as a financial analyst. I left after a divorce, needed a complete change." I stared at her in disbelief. This waitress who had been showing me how to balance 5 plates at once had been a Wall Street financial analyst? "If you're willing to trust me, I'd like to look at whatever documents you saved," she offered. The next evening, we met at her small apartment. I brought the folder of papers I'd kept hidden in my truck: bank statements, copies of my father's will, the fake cryptocurrency investment reports, and a few other documents I'd managed to save. Abigail spread them across her kitchen table, examining each one carefully. "These crypto investment statements are definitely fabricated," she said, pointing to inconsistencies in the formatting and transaction codes. "And these withdrawal records show a pattern that doesn't match legitimate investment practices." She took detailed notes, explaining what each document revealed and what was still missing from our evidence. "The key is finding where the money actually went," she explained. "These withdrawals left your trust fund, but where did they land?" Abigail's boyfriend Derek came over while we were working. He was a burly man with a surprisingly gentle manner who worked in cybersecurity for a regional bank. "Crypto scams are my specialty," he said after Abigail explained the situation. Mind if I take a look? Derek identified several red flags immediately. This supposed cryptocurrency your stepmother claimed to invest in? It never existed. There's no record of it on any legitimate exchange. Over the next few weeks, we established a routine. After our shifts, Abigail and I would go to her apartment where Derek would join us after his work. They began teaching me about forensic accounting and digital investigation. Slowly, we built a case file documenting the fraud. Derek managed to trace some of the withdrawals to a shell company called Meridian Investments. It's registered in the Cayman Islands, he explained. Hard to penetrate, but not impossible. The company was created 2 months before your father died. Can you tell who owns it? I asked. Not directly, but I'm working on it. These offshore structures are designed to hide ownership. One evening, as I was walking to my truck after our latest strategy session, I found a note under my windshield wiper. In typed letters it read, "Stop asking questions if you know what's good for you." I showed it to Abigail and Derek, who immediately became concerned. "This means we're getting close," Derek said. "But it also means they know you're investigating." 2 days later, I came out of the diner to find my truck had been vandalized. The windows were smashed, and someone had carved the word "leave" into the hood. Most disturbing of all, they had gone through my possessions. The folder with my documents was missing, though thankfully I had given the originals to Abigail for safekeeping. Ruby installed security cameras around the diner after that incident. For the business, she claimed, but I noticed they covered the parking area where I kept my truck. She didn't mention the fact that I was sleeping there, but the message was clear: she was looking out for me. A week later, her caution proved justified when 2 men in an expensive black SUV came into the diner during my shift. They didn't order food, just coffee, which they barely touched while watching me work. When Ruby approached their table, they left abruptly. "They were asking about you," Ruby told me later. "Wanted to know how long you'd worked here, where you lived. I played dumb, said you were just a new girl passing through." The security camera footage showed the men examining my truck in the parking lot before leaving. Derek ran the license plate through a database and discovered the vehicle was registered to a private security firm with ties to several financial institutions, including Judith's former employer. Our investigation suffered a serious setback when I was served with legal papers at the diner. Judith had filed for a restraining order against me, claiming I had been harassing her with threatening phone calls and showing up at her house. It was completely fabricated, but the temporary order was granted pending a hearing. The sheriff who served the papers was clearly uncomfortable. "Just stay away from her until the hearing date," he advised. These things usually get sorted out in court, but I knew Judith was counting on me not having the resources to fight the order properly. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in Seattle, a 2-hour drive from where I was now living, and on a day I was supposed to work. Ruby found me crying in the break room after the sheriff left. "Take the day off for the hearing," she said gruffly. "Job will still be here." "But what if it isn't?" I asked, voicing my fear. "What if she wins and then comes after my job too?" Ruby's weathered face hardened. "I decide who works in my diner, not some city lady with fancy lawyers. Now stop crying and get back to work. Table 6 needs coffee." That night, Abigail, Derek, and I reviewed our options. The restraining order was a strategic move by Judith, a way to paint me as unstable and dangerous while limiting my ability to gather evidence against her. It was also a warning. She knew I was investigating and was demonstrating her power. "We need to be more careful," Derek warned. "But we can't stop now. In fact, I think we need to accelerate our timeline." He revealed that he'd made progress tracking the money trail. Several large transfers from Meridian Investments had gone to accounts in Switzerland and the Bahamas. He couldn't yet prove these accounts belonged to Judith or her accomplices, but the pattern was suspicious. "She's moving money around, trying to hide it," he explained. That suggests she's worried about discovery. Abigail frowned. We still don't have enough for the authorities to act. We need something concrete that ties Judith directly to the fraud. As we were talking, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, fearing it might be Judith or her lawyers, but something told me to take the call. The connection was poor, with static on the line, but the voice was unmistakable even after 3 years. Samantha, can you hear me? It's Uncle Howard. I'm alive, and I'm coming to find you. I nearly dropped the phone. Uncle Howard? My voice cracked with disbelief. Abigail and Derek watched, wide-eyed, as I put the call on speaker. Yes, it's me, came the familiar voice through the static. I don't have much time to explain right now. Where are you staying? I need to see you. I hesitated, years of Judith's manipulation making me cautious even with someone I'd once trusted completely. How do I know it's really you? I asked. They told me you died in Thailand 3 years ago. Your 6th birthday, he replied without hesitation. You wanted a chemistry set, but your mom thought it was too dangerous. I bought you one anyway and snuck it to you. We conducted experiments in the garage on weekends when your parents thought you were helping me fix my motorcycle. Tears streamed down my face. No one else could have known that story. It was our secret, never shared even with my parents. I gave him the address of the diner, agreeing to meet during my shift the next day. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. Your uncle? Abigail asked gently. The one who supposedly died? Yes, I whispered. Judith lied about that too. The next day, I was a nervous wreck, dropping orders and mixing up tickets. Ruby noticed but didn't comment, just picked up my slack with unusual patience. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my head snapped up, heart racing. It was during the mid-afternoon lull when he finally walked in. Howard looked older, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, his face weathered. He wore a worn leather jacket and carried a backpack that had seen better days. But his eyes, warm brown like my father's, were exactly as I remembered. I froze by the coffee machine, unable to move. He spotted me immediately and stopped too, emotion washing over his face. Then I was running across the diner, customers forgotten, and throwing myself into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Ruby appeared beside us. Take your break, Sam. Use my office in the back. Howard and I sat across from each other in Ruby's cluttered office, both of us struggling to find words after the initial emotional reunion. They told me you were dead, I finally said. A boating accident in Thailand. Howard's expression darkened. That was part of their plan. I never went to Thailand. Judith and her partner Greg set me up, Samantha. They created an elaborate scheme to frame me for financial fraud just after Richard died. He explained how, shortly after my father's funeral, he had begun investigating Judith's background, suspicious of the changes to my father's will. He discovered she had a history of targeting wealthy men, though she'd always been careful to avoid criminal charges. I found evidence that she'd been manipulating your father's medications, Howard said gravely. I can't prove it caused his heart attack, but I believe she was slowly poisoning him to accelerate her timeline. Before he could take his findings to authorities, Judith discovered his investigation. With the help of Greg, who Howard revealed was actually a disbarred attorney with connections to organized crime, they planted evidence suggesting Howard had been embezzling from his own company. I got a tip from a friend in law enforcement that they were about to arrest me, he continued. The charges were completely fabricated, but they had created a paper trail convincing enough that I'd spend years in legal battles trying to clear my name. Howard made the difficult decision to disappear, using cash and resources Judith couldn't track to flee the country. He'd spent the last 3 years moving between South America and Europe, using aliases and cash-only transactions to avoid detection while building a case against Judith and Greg. I've been gathering evidence against them, he explained. Banking records, witness statements from their previous victims, documentation of shell companies they've used for money laundering. It's taken me this long to build something solid enough to bring to authorities. Why didn't you contact me? I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. I thought you were dead. I've been living in my truck, Howard. His eyes filled with tears. I tried, Samantha. I sent messages through people I thought I could trust, but they never reached you. Judith was monitoring your communications, and I had to stay completely off the grid. One wrong move and I'd be arrested, useless to both of us. He reached across the table and took my hands. But I never stopped trying to find a way back to you. When I finally got word of where you were, his voice broke. I had no idea things had gotten this bad. I failed you, and I'm so sorry. We spent hours in that small office, piecing together the full picture of Judith's conspiracy. Howard had discovered that Greg was not just Judith's accomplice, but her lover of many years. Together, they had orchestrated similar schemes with at least 2 other wealthy men before my father. The cryptocurrency story was clever, Howard acknowledged grimly. It's difficult to trace, poorly understood by most people, and volatile enough that massive losses seem plausible. I introduced Howard to Abigail and Derek after my shift, and we moved our base of operations to Abigail's apartment. When Howard saw the evidence we'd already gathered, he was impressed. You've done incredible work, he told us, spreading his own documents on the table alongside ours. With what I have, we can finally nail them. Howard's investigation had uncovered a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The documentation showed how Judith and Greg had systematically siphoned money, not just from my inheritance, but from my father's business before his death. They've stolen approximately $3 million in total, Howard explained. Your $850,000 was just part of their haul. Most damning of all, Howard had located the actual accounts where my inheritance had been transferred, accounts in the Cayman Islands directly linked to Judith and Greg. We have enough to go to the FBI now, he said. This crosses state lines and involves international banking. It's federal jurisdiction. As we were celebrating this breakthrough, Derek's laptop pinged with an alert. He had set up a monitoring system for certain financial transactions related to our case. There's movement, he said, typing rapidly. Large transfers from the Cayman accounts. They're moving money again. Howard leaned over his shoulder, frowning at the screen. They know we're onto them. Someone tipped them off. As if to confirm his suspicion, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know your uncle is back. Tell him to walk away or things will get worse for both of you. Howard's face hardened. We need to move fast. They're preparing to run, but before we could decide on our next steps, there was a knock at Abigail's door. We all froze, looking at each other in alarm. Abigail peeked through the peephole, then relaxed. It's just my neighbor, she said, opening the door. But it wasn't her neighbor standing there. It was Heather, looking nothing like the polished, privileged young woman from social media. Her face was pale and drawn, her designer clothes replaced by a simple hoodie and jeans. I need to talk to Samantha, she said, her voice shaking. I know what my mother did. Howard immediately moved between me and Heather, his body language protective and suspicious. This could be a trap, he warned. Heather's eyes widened when she saw Howard. You're alive, she whispered. Mom said you drowned. Clearly, your mother lies about a lot of things, Howard replied coldly. I studied my stepsister's face, searching for signs of deception. The Heather I knew was confident to the point of arrogance, always composed. This girl looked frightened and exhausted. How did you find me? I demanded. I hired a private investigator, she admitted. I've been looking for you for weeks. After a tense discussion, we agreed to let Heather in but kept our documents hidden. Derek positioned himself near the door, and Abigail casually moved a kitchen knife within reach on the counter. None of us trusted this sudden appearance. Heather sat perched on the edge of Abigail's couch, clutching her purse like a shield. I didn't know everything at first, she began. Mom told me your dad had left the business in bad shape, that we needed to protect the assets from creditors. According to Heather, she had initially believed Judith's lies about my inheritance being lost in bad investments. It wasn't until recently, when she overheard Judith and Greg discussing plans to leave the country, that she began to suspect the truth. They were talking about accounts in Europe, new identities, Heather explained. Greg said something about making sure the Wells girl couldn't track them. That's when I realized they'd been lying to me too. Curiosity piqued. Heather had started searching through Judith's home office while her mother was out. She found documents relating to multiple shell companies and offshore accounts, including records of my inheritance being systematically transferred out of the country. I took pictures of everything, she said, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. I didn't know what to do with them until I found you. Howard took the phone, scrolling through dozens of photos of financial documents, his expression darkening with each swipe. These are real, he confirmed, showing one to Derek, who nodded in agreement. Why are you helping me now? I asked Heather, still suspicious. You were happy enough to take my mother's ring, live in my room, spend money that was stolen from me. Tears filled Heather's eyes. I know I can't fix what happened. I was awful to you, and I'm sorry. But Mom and Greg are planning to leave the country this weekend. They've booked flights to Switzerland under fake names. Once they're gone, all that money, your money, will be impossible to recover. Howard connected Heather's phone to Derek's laptop, downloading the photos for closer examination. These fill in the gaps in our evidence, he said. We now have a complete paper trail from Richard's accounts to Judith's offshore holdings. Abigail, who had been quiet throughout Heather's explanation, finally spoke. This doesn't make sense. Why betray your mother now? What do you get out of it? Heather looked down, twisting her hands together. 2 weeks ago, I overheard Mom and Greg talking about me. Greg said I was a liability who knew too much. Mom agreed that they needed to cut all ties once they were settled abroad. Her voice broke. She was going to abandon me too. I recognized the hurt in Heather's eyes, the same betrayal I had felt when I realized Judith had been manipulating me for years. Despite everything Heather had done, I felt a flicker of sympathy. With Heather's evidence added to our own, Howard determined we had enough to approach the authorities. But timing was critical. If Judith and Greg realized Heather had turned on them, they might flee immediately. Howard contacted an old friend, Special Agent Karen Wilson of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He had worked with her years earlier on cybersecurity projects and trusted her discretion. She agreed to meet us the following morning to review our evidence. We need a secure place to stay tonight, Howard said after the call. They already know about Abigail's apartment, and my hotel isn't safe either. Ruby's brother Frank, who we learned was a retired sheriff, offered his cabin 20 miles outside town. It was remote and defensible, with no paper trail connecting it to any of us. We relocated there that evening, bringing all our evidence and setting up a makeshift command center on Frank's dining room table. Throughout the night, we organized our documentation into a cohesive narrative of Judith and Greg's crimes. 1. The systematic manipulation of my father before his death, including possible medication tampering. 2. The fraudulent changes to his will, giving Judith control of assets. 3. The frame-up of Howard to remove him as a potential guardian for me. 4. The theft of my inheritance through fabricated cryptocurrency investments. 5. The gaslighting campaign to discredit me when I began asking questions. 6. The network of offshore accounts used to hide the stolen funds. 2. The planned escape to Switzerland with new identities. Heather provided perhaps the most damning evidence. Text messages between her and Judith discussing how to handle Samantha after she began investigating her inheritance. In one exchange, Judith explicitly instructed Heather to keep playing the spoiled sister role to make me appear jealous and unstable. By morning, we had compiled a comprehensive file that even the most skeptical investigator would find compelling. We met Agent Wilson at a secure FBI facility in the nearest city, where she reviewed our evidence with growing concern. "This is an extremely sophisticated fraud scheme," she acknowledged after several hours. "And the evidence is substantial. We'll need to move quickly if they're planning to leave the country Saturday." Agent Wilson assembled a team of financial crime specialists who began the process of freezing the offshore accounts we had identified. However, they encountered unexpected resistance from banking authorities in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. "Judith has connections in international banking," Agent Wilson explained. "Someone's running interference. We're working through diplomatic channels, but it's going to take time we may not have." Meanwhile, Derek monitored financial transactions associated with the accounts we knew about, watching for any signs that Judith and Greg were moving money again. Late that afternoon, his system alerted to a massive transfer attempt from one of the Cayman accounts to a bank in Dubai. "They're moving faster than expected," Howard said grimly. "They must suspect Heather's involvement." Heather's phone rang, Judith's name flashing on the screen. Agent Wilson nodded for her to answer. "Recording equipment at the ready." "Hi, Mom," Heather said, her voice remarkably steady. "Where have you been?" Judith demanded. "I've been calling you for hours." "Sorry, my phone was dead. I stayed at Madison's last night." "Come home immediately. We need to discuss the trip we talked about." "The Switzerland trip?" Heather asked, looking at Agent Wilson, who nodded encouragement. A pause on the line. "Who have you been talking to?" Judith's voice had turned cold. "No one. You mentioned Switzerland last week, remember? Just come home, now." The line went dead. "She's suspicious," Agent Wilson said. "We need to accelerate our timeline. I'm going to request emergency freezing orders for all associated accounts." While the FBI worked through legal channels, Howard, Derek, and I continued searching for any accounts or assets we might have missed. Abigail used her financial expertise to analyze the money flow patterns, identifying likely locations for additional hidden funds. Frank, who had been quietly supportive throughout, revealed he had connections in the international banking security community from his law enforcement days. He made several calls, speaking cryptically about potential system vulnerabilities that might need immediate attention. Within hours, we received word that several major Swiss banks had suddenly flagged accounts associated with Judith and Greg's aliases for security review, effectively locking them down without the lengthy legal process normally required. "Sometimes the old ways work best," Frank said with a wink when I thanked him. By evening, Agent Wilson confirmed that they had successfully frozen over $2.8 million in assets connected to Judith and Greg's operation. The FBI had also obtained warrants for their arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy. "We'll take them into custody tomorrow morning," she told us. "I'd advise all of you to stay here at the cabin until the operation is complete. We don't know how desperate they might become if they realize their assets are frozen." That night, as we waited anxiously for morning, Heather approached me on the cabin's small porch where I had gone for fresh air. "I have something for you," she said, holding out her closed fist. When she opened it, my mother's engagement ring lay in her palm. "This should have been yours all along. I'm sorry I took it." As I slipped the ring onto my finger, feeling its familiar weight, I realized we had come full circle. 3 years of lies, manipulation, and hardship were about to end, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt hope for the future. Dawn broke with a call from Agent Wilson. "They know," she said without preamble. "Judith tried to access one of the frozen accounts last night and received notification of the federal hold. They're on the move. Our carefully planned morning arrest had just become an urgent manhunt. The FBI had agents stationed near Judith's house, but during the night, she and Greg had somehow slipped away unnoticed. Their phones were off, and their regular vehicles remained in the garage. We've issued a bolo and notified airport security, but they have resources and connections, Agent Wilson explained. We need to figure out where they might go. Heather, looking pale but determined, suggested checking a lake house that belonged to Greg's cousin. Mom mentioned it as a backup once. It's very isolated, about 3 hours north of Seattle. While Agent Wilson dispatched a team to investigate the lake house, Howard had another idea. Judith is pragmatic. She wouldn't run without access to funds. Check for recent withdrawals from local banks' accounts we might not know about yet. Derek, working with the FBI's technical team, identified a safety deposit box in Judith's name at Seattle First National that had been accessed that morning. Security footage showed Judith, wearing a blonde wig and sunglasses, entering the bank shortly after opening. She's still in the city, Agent Wilson concluded. And now she has whatever was in that box, probably cash and portable valuables. Heather's phone buzzed with a text. Meet me at our special place. Come alone. Last chance to join us. Mom, what's the special place? Howard asked urgently. It's a cafe where we used to have mother-daughter talks, Heather replied. The Bluebird on Westlake Avenue. Agent Wilson immediately began organizing a tactical team, but I saw an opportunity. Let Heather respond, I suggested. Tell Judith you'll meet her, but you need time to pack some things. We can set up a controlled meeting. Howard objected strenuously, concerned for both our safety, but Agent Wilson saw the potential in the plan. We can wire Heather and have agents in position throughout the cafe. It might be our best chance to take them peacefully. 2 hours later, everything was in place. Heather sat nervously at a table by the window in the Bluebird Cafe, wearing a concealed recording device. FBI agents posing as customers and staff were positioned strategically throughout the space. Howard, Agent Wilson, and I watched from a surveillance van parked across the street. At precisely noon, Judith walked in. She had abandoned the blonde wig but wore large sunglasses and a scarf over her hair. She scanned the cafe carefully before approaching Heather's table. You're alone? She asked, remaining standing. Heather nodded. I did exactly what you said, Mom. Judith slid into the chair opposite her daughter, removing her sunglasses to reveal tired, suspicious eyes. We don't have much time. Greg is waiting with the car 3 blocks from here. We're driving to Canada tonight. What about the money? Heather asked, following the script we had prepared. I thought everything was frozen. A tight smile crossed Judith's face. Not everything, darling. I've been planning this for years. There are always contingencies. Through our headsets, we heard Judith explain that she had stockpiled cash, gold, and bearer bonds in safety deposit boxes under various names. She also had a separate account in Dubai that the authorities hadn't discovered yet. There's more than enough for us to start over, Judith assured Heather. We just need to get out of the country. I have contacts who can provide new identities once we're in Europe. What about Samantha? Heather asked, going off script. She's living in her truck, Mom. She has nothing. Judith's expression hardened. Samantha was collateral damage. I needed Richard's assets, and she was in the way. It's unfortunate, but that's business. And Uncle Howard? You told everyone he was dead. Howard was too smart for his own good, Judith replied dismissively. The drowning story was convenient. No body, no questions. Greg handled the paperwork. As Judith continued detailing their escape plan, Agent Wilson signaled her team to move into position. But before they could approach, the cafe door opened again, and Greg entered, looking agitated. We need to go now, he said urgently to Judith. Something's wrong. The car was tampered with. Judith stood immediately, grabbing Heather's arm. "Come on. We have a backup vehicle." That's when Agent Wilson gave the signal. FBI agents converged from all directions, identifying themselves and ordering Judith and Greg to put their hands up. For a moment, it seemed they might comply, then Greg shoved a table toward the nearest agent and made a break for the back exit. Judith, still gripping Heather's arm, pulled a small canister from her purse and sprayed something in her daughter's face. Heather cried out, falling back as Judith pushed past her toward the front door. I watched in horror from the van as the scene descended into chaos. Howard was already running toward the cafe, with Agent Wilson shouting into her radio for agents to secure both exits. Greg made it as far as the alley before being tackled by 2 FBI agents. Judith, however, burst out the front door and ran directly toward our surveillance van, apparently not realizing what it was. When she yanked the side door open, she found herself face to face with me. Time seemed to stop as we stared at each other, my stepmother and I, separated by 3 years of lies, theft, and betrayal. Her carefully maintained facade had crumbled, revealing the calculating coldness beneath. "You," she hissed, "you ruined everything." "No, Judith," I replied calmly. "You did that yourself." She lunged toward me, but FBI agents were already there, pulling her back and securing her hands with zip ties. As they led her away, she turned to deliver one final barb. "Your father was a fool," she spat. So desperate for companionship, he never questioned anything. The heart medication I gave him made it so easy. He practically handed me his fortune. I felt my blood run cold at this confirmation of what Howard had suspected, that my father's death had been more than natural causes. Agent Wilson, who had heard the statement, immediately instructed the arresting agents to document Judith's words exactly. Inside the cafe, Heather was receiving medical attention for the pepper spray Judith had used on her. Despite her tears and reddened eyes, she seemed almost relieved. "I'm sorry," she said when I approached. "I didn't know she would try to run. I thought she would just talk." "You did well," I assured her, surprising myself with the lack of anger I felt toward my stepsister. "Your testimony will be crucial in building the case against her." Within hours, both Judith and Greg were processed and held without bail due to flight risk. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, conspiracy, assault on federal officers, and most seriously, investigation into the possible homicide of my father through medication tampering. The FBI forensic accounting team continued to uncover the full extent of their crimes, identifying additional victims beyond my family. Greg, facing the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, quickly began offering information in exchange for leniency. In a private interview room at the FBI field office, Agent Wilson updated us on the case. "Greg is cooperating fully," she explained. "He's provided details on all their financial accounts, including several we hadn't discovered yet. We've already frozen an additional $1.2 million. What about my inheritance?" I asked. "The recovery process will take time," she cautioned. "But based on the evidence, the court should have no problem ordering restitution. We've already identified about $780,000 of your original inheritance in various accounts." Howard placed his hand on my shoulder. "We'll get it all back, Sam. And more importantly, they'll pay for what they did to our family." As we prepared to leave, an FBI agent escorted Heather into the room. She had given her formal statement and was now facing an uncertain future of her own. "Will I be charged too?" she asked Agent Wilson directly. "That's for the prosecutors to decide," Wilson replied. "Your cooperation will be taken into consideration, but you did benefit from the fraud, even if you weren't fully aware of it." I found myself speaking up. Heather helped us when it mattered. Without her evidence, we might not have caught them in time. Agent Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "I'll make sure that's noted prominently in my report." Outside the FBI building, standing in the fading evening light, Heather and I faced each other awkwardly. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "But I am sorry, Samantha, for everything. I studied the girl who had once taken pleasure in my downfall, now humbled by her own mother's betrayal. I'm not ready to forgive everything," I admitted. "But I understand being manipulated by Judith better than anyone. We were both her victims, in different ways." As Heather turned to leave, I called after her. "Where will you go?" She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. The house will probably be seized as evidence. I don't really have anyone else." Howard and I exchanged glances. After a moment, he sighed. "We can help you find a place to stay temporarily," he offered. "Until you figure things out." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. But it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild from the wreckage Judith had created of both our lives. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial recovery, and personal healing. The criminal case against Judith and Greg moved forward with overwhelming evidence, including Judith's inadvertent confession about tampering with my father's medication. Forensic analysis of his preserved tissue samples confirmed trace amounts of a drug that could trigger cardiac events when combined with his prescribed heart medication. The prosecutors added second-degree murder charges, making a plea deal virtually impossible. Facing the prospect of life imprisonment, Judith maintained her icy composure while Greg crumbled, offering testimony against her in exchange for reduced charges. Through patient work with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, we managed to recover approximately $820,000 of my original inheritance, nearly the full amount. The court also awarded me additional damages from Judith and Greg's other assets, though much of that money would take years to fully recover from international accounts. With Howard's help, I found a modest but comfortable 2-bedroom house about 30 minutes from the Crossroads Diner. After living in my truck for so long, having a real roof over my head felt like unimaginable luxury. I kept my job at the diner, though now by choice rather than desperation. Ruby pretended to be annoyed that I stayed, but couldn't hide her smile when I brought in homemade cookies on my days off. My relationship with Howard flourished as we rebuilt our family bond. He moved to Montana permanently, buying a small cabin about 20 minutes from my place. We established a Sunday dinner tradition, taking turns hosting each week and slowly healing from the trauma we'd both experienced. Heather's situation was more complicated. She avoided criminal charges due to her cooperation, but faced significant civil penalties for her role in spending fraudulently obtained funds. The court required her to pay back approximately $230,000, though the judge allowed a reasonable payment plan based on her limited income. With nowhere else to go, she initially stayed in a spare room at Abigail's apartment. Later, she found work as a receptionist at a local veterinary clinic and rented a small studio apartment nearby. Our relationship remained cautious but cordial. We weren't friends, exactly, but we weren't enemies anymore either. "She asks about you," Howard told me one evening after running into Heather at the grocery store. "I think she genuinely wants to make amends." "I'm not ready," I admitted. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Howard nodded, understanding the complexity of forgiveness. "Take your time, Sam. Healing isn't linear." With my financial situation stabilized, I made the decision to return to college. I enrolled in a program for financial law at the State University, attending evening classes while continuing to work part-time at the diner. The experience with Judith had awakened a passion for protecting others from similar fraud schemes. During my second semester, inspired by a business law course, I began developing plans for a foundation in my father's name. The Richard Wells Foundation for Financial Literacy would provide education and legal resources to victims of financial fraud and elder abuse. Howard enthusiastically backed the idea, offering both seed money and his technical expertise. "Richard would be incredibly proud of you," He told me as we reviewed the foundation proposal. You've taken something terrible and turned it into something that will help others. My relationship with Ruby and Abigail evolved from workplace friendship into chosen family. Ruby, despite her gruff exterior, became something of a surrogate grandmother, regularly sending me home with containers of homemade soup and practical advice. Abigail and Derek invited me for monthly game nights at their apartment, where the conversation never turned to the case unless I brought it up first. 1 year after Howard walked into the diner, we celebrated with a special dinner at Ruby's place. She closed early for the private event, putting up a handwritten sign that simply read "Family Gathering." Ruby, Abigail, Derek, Howard, Frank, and even Agent Wilson gathered around the largest table. The only person missing was Heather, whom I hadn't been ready to include despite Howard's gentle encouragement. As Ruby served her famous pot roast, she announced gruffly, "No payment tonight. Family eats free." "I can pay, Ruby," I protested, no longer the destitute waitress living in her truck. "Did I stutter?" Ruby replied, but her eyes were kind. "Some things matter more than money, girl. You should know that by now." Later that evening, sitting on Ruby's porch swing with Howard, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I never thought I'd say this, I admitted, but in some ways, losing everything was the best thing that could have happened to me. Howard raised an eyebrow. "Really? The homelessness and poverty were the best thing?" I laughed. "Not that part, obviously. But if Judith hadn't stolen my inheritance, I would have just taken the money and gone on with my life. I would never have discovered what I'm really capable of, or who my true friends are." "You would have found your way eventually," Howard said confidently. "You're your father's daughter, resilient and smart." The mention of my father brought a familiar pang of grief, but now it was tempered with something like peace. "Do you think he would be disappointed that I couldn't protect what he left me?" Howard shook his head firmly. "Richard didn't leave you money, Sam. That was just a thing, a resource. He left you his determination, his integrity, his intelligence, the things that truly matter, the things Judith could never take away." The following week, I took a step that surprised even myself. I visited Heather at her apartment, bringing a potted plant as a housewarming gift. Our conversation was awkward but necessary, laying groundwork for a relationship that would never be sisterly but might someday reach genuine understanding. "We both lost our families because of Judith's actions," I told her. "I'm not saying we'll ever be close, but I don't want to carry that anger forever." Heather's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. This isn't about what anyone deserves," I replied. "It's about what I need to move forward." As summer turned to fall, I found myself leading a support group for fraud victims at the local community center. Each week, people shared stories of betrayal and financial devastation that echoed my own experience. I couldn't solve all their problems, but I could offer understanding and practical advice for rebuilding. After one session, a young woman named Lily approached me. Her elderly grandmother had been swindled out of her life savings by a caregiver, leaving the family in dire straits. "How do you do it?" she asked tearfully. "How do you start over when everything's gone?" I thought about my journey from my father's death to this moment. The pain, the truck, the diner, the investigation, the confrontation, and finally, the healing. "You begin with one step," I told her, taking her hand, "and you remember that your worth isn't measured by your bank account. Then you find your people, the ones who see your value even when you have nothing. They become the foundation you rebuild on." As Lily wiped away tears, I realized how far I had come from the desperate, homeless young woman who had once believed she had nothing left. My inheritance hadn't just been recovered, it had been redefined. What has your experience been with betrayal and rebuilding trust? Have you ever had to start over completely like Samantha did in this story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our stories helps others feel less alone in their struggles. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button. Subscribe to hear more real-life stories of resilience. And share with someone who might need to hear that even after losing everything, it's possible to build something new and beautiful. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes our greatest strength is revealed only when everything else is stripped away.